is that the number in 2021 is going to be nearly 8,000 census towns. Now that has very important considerations if we have to look at how rural and urban are emerging simultaneously in a particular specific way. But I will proceed for the time being to show you some more. Sorry, this is coming the right side first. Our idea of rural is that the rural people mostly used to spend on food items and food grains. That is no longer the case. If you look at the non-food expenses, it's now 51% compared to just 36% about 15, 20 years ago. If you also look at the absolute poverty, which is the headcount ratio below the 2,400 or 1,900 kilocalories per day per person, this has reduced now almost half from 1993, which is about 25 years. And these data are, sometimes you will find it a little bit of change if you look at different data sets, but more or less this confirms to the overall direction of the changes that is happening in rural India. There's a significant non-farm employment in rural India itself, which is now more than about 41%. And this is, I'm talking at 2012, so next 6 years have gone by. And it has actually increased further, but we don't have very reliable data at the moment. This is also consistent with the fact that this 47% what you see are not cultivators have gone up now to 58% actually. So this is also a change that is happening in rural India. I want to show you something very interesting. 80% of rural households are using electricity. And now this is, sometimes we may have to interpret it slightly carefully. This is not always a legal electric connection. It also has a component of illegal electric connections. But the change is quite significant, from 43% to this about 80%. If you look at a little more about education, the primary school, upper primary school enrollments are in general pretty good. And this is the data we mostly maintain on an every year basis. GER refers to general enrollment ratio, which means the number of kids in a particular school, irrespective of their age. The net enrollment ratio refers to number of kids of an appropriate age in the primary schools. So GER always is slightly higher than NER. If you also look at rural roads, for example, now this 70% is about 2013 data. So rural habitations are connected by all weather roads. It was just about 46%. The mobile penetration is changing very fast in every year. So the reliable data that is there from the NSSO 2013 is about 54%, but now I guess it is more than 65% or so. But it was just about 4% just 10 years ago. I'll have two more to show you, which is that Pakka housing, what we call is about 66% in comparison to just 36%. And the other thing that we need to also recognize through these changes is that the health indicators have not been very significant to the extent that we could have expected. If you compare the change in the education, the health indicators have not really changed that much. That's what we can say. But overall, if we look at these 10 very aggregate facts, what we are witnessing is a very clear transformation of an isolated, village-oriented, local production, local consumption, subsistence economy, very closed caste and class structure, not connected with the outside world, a self-contained economy, kind of a imagination of Indian rural, to a highly connected globally, in fact, nationally, I would say, and with a general development of infrastructure, physical, social, as well as the general infrastructure. So there's a direct, clear movement towards what we, in sociology, they would, or in economics, they would call modernization. So that is what the first part of the talk is, where we are trying to demonstrate that there is really a very significant set of changes that have happened. Now, this is a part of a very long presentation that we use in our classes, and where we actually show some 25 different parameters on showing how rural India has changed. But I've just sliced it off for the time given for this webinar. Now, what does this data tell us? There are three things I want to push here to be appreciated. One is that there's been some significant progress in the aggregate data. I wouldn't say that this is fantastic. A comparable change in the comparable period in China may have been, and certainly has been much, much more. But given the type of country we are, I would not call it an insignificant progress in the aggregate data level. Where we see really lack of such quantitative progress, we now have to look at more closely towards regional and local and social issues and factors, and not only at a grand and macro aggregate level. And that is where it leads to my further discussion about what we would have to imagine the rural development or rural transformation in a slightly different way. Of course, one thing has not really changed much. The progress is really modest, that is health. In last 4 or 5 years, this is showing some promise, but it is yet to be really measured in a very large scale way. Now, given this scenario, what I would try to argue is that we now have to look at a macro level transformative change. And in that sense, it's more qualitative change than the aggregate quantitative change that we have been pushing for the last 50, 60 years. Our emphasis has always been in the entire rural development, rural transformation, has been on quantity, because this is quite natural, because we have the second largest population to cover. Our starting point at 1947 was with a very low base. So simple numbers of coverage, whether it is number of houses or number of roads or number of schools, that has been a dominant feature in our thinking about how to change rural India. But we need to now look at more for a transformative change, which is more about quality. And I will explain a little bit about that in a minute. But before that, I also want to emphasize that even though the aggregate level change is significant and promising, it is now time to focus on the issue of socioeconomic inclusion, because wherever we see that the aggregate is actually not that promising, it has relationships with socioeconomic exclusion. And I'll explain a little bit in next few slides as well, which tells us that the overall framework of the rural development as we understood needs to be revised. Now, before I go to the thinking about the revision, I want to explain the first two things a little bit more, which requires me to take you to some further data. Now, let us say that the aggregate level electricity use has been not that bad, it's quite promising. But if you look at access to electricity in the monthly personal expenditure, consumption expenditure class, and you plot it through the 5 most dominant quantiles, both are percentage terms. These first two, 0 to 20, 20 to 40, you'll see that the access to electricity varies very significantly between almost 60% to almost 90% between these expenditure class, which means aggregate level may be looking good, but there's a real disaggregate data has definite concerns. Just look at the other way, the same thing in another way. What is the access to electricity for different social groups, ST, SC, OBC, and others? And you will see the dominant feature here is the others. If we look at state-wise data, and these data currently are becoming a little fuzzy because the data are now a lot. 8 states are fully electrified, including some southern states, western states, etc. And the 7 states have yet to catch up a lot. And these are some of the so-called Bimaru states. And some 10 states have some small catch-up to do. If I go a little farther to show you something interesting, which is the poverty impact. And now poverty has really declined on an aggregate basis, but if you disaggregate across the different social groups, at the ST level, which is about 8% of the population, the poverty is 45%. SC, which is pretty large population in the country, the poverty is still about 33%. But for others, it is just about 20%. So the aggregate data sometimes hides the disaggregated picture, where we have to look at more regional and local factors to see where these differences are coming from. Even in the states where poverty has on an aggregate level declined substantially, there are pockets of poverty which are of real concern. These are the states where at the aggregate level as well, there is more than 30% poverty line, 30% people below the poverty line. I look at something interesting here, which is that is where this quality question comes up. If you look at drinking water, although 90% of the population now have access to safe drinking water, and this is not from just a government data, these are all independently verified data. But if you look at drinking water source outside the dwelling, and if you plot it across the expenditure class, you will see that the poorer, the 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 60 to 55%, 58%, the drinking water source is still outside the dwelling. If you look at the same thing in a social group, kind of a cut, you will see again that the drinking water source outside the dwelling is the highest for STs, and then followed by SCs and others. So which means, even though at an aggregate level, we see good progress, if we disaggregate, there are issues to be looked at. I'll show you something. Before I do that, need to basically put some emphasis on the overall progress on health. And these are the very critical factors that are measured under 5 mortality, under 1 mortality, maternal mortality, and all of these except the latrine coverage. And no, I would say only the latrine coverage. I think we are still doing very modestly on any other factors. Particularly, we are doing very, very badly on the sex ratio among the 0 to 6 category. And this is a cause for national worry. I want to show you something which is, before I do that, let me now come back to my basic argument today, which is that we need to conceptualize differently about what we understand as transformative change. And I have 4 or 5 things to say in this. One is that for a long time, we have been focusing on providing very basic needs to the population in rural India. And that required basically a water, that required some basic health infrastructure, etc. But I think we need to move now from basic needs to robust quality of life, which can be measured in multiple ways. The other thing that we also need to look at is that we cannot look at any more rural development and urban development in isolation. And there's a strong literature that has evolved in the last 20 years, or basically 15 to 20 years, which says that there is nothing particularly rural anymore. There is now almost a continuum from rural to urban, which is why a new term has been introduced into literature called rurban. This continuum is a result of transformation from a very isolated local subsistence economy towards a very integrated economy. There's a transformation from purely agriculture to non-farm livelihoods, connectivity, penetration, including electricity and telecom penetration, a good amount of migration, and good amount of also remittances. So there are multiple factors influencing this continuum, but this is a new phenomenon which we need to recognize when we are discussing rural development. We can't have discussions on rural development isolated from urban development anymore. The third aspect is that we have been talking purely functional or, sorry, in terms of quantitative development terms, but we have not paid adequate attention to what we may call socioeconomic inclusion. And some of the data that I was showing you, we actually have for our students a lot more data, but I thought we'll just use a few. And then the last two items are, one is about linking development with sustainability. And I will explain a little further, because we have been discussing development only on the making rural to become urban, but we need to also combine that with strong element of sustainability. Else we are going to face a huge sets of crises that we are already in. And obviously from purely quantitative targets to quality targets is the new. So I will combine these together to show some data in support of what I am arguing for. And here you can find them. So for example, quality of life. Even if you have electricity connection, and this coverage is more than 93% now actually, even if we have coverage of electricity, the daily availability is just about 5 hours, which means we may have done some quantitative basic coverage, but we have not improved the quality part of it. Schooling is a real worry. I mean, kids are in school, no matter whether they're in private school or public schools, but the learning is very poor. And reports after reports every year speak on that. There have been some marginal improvement in the current year's ESSER report, but overall the scenario is still pretty precarious. And this is where, again, the issue about coverage versus quality. Now most of the kids are in school. Those days are gone when people were asking for more schools, people were asking that kids are not in school. This is what we have done mostly in the last 20 years. But if you look at the learning pass aspect of it, we are still far away. And there's another interesting data that I want you to look at, which is, although we isolated way drinking water, latrine, electricity, we may have done well. But if you combine these three together for a household, the national achievement is just 24%, which means that individually, if we quantify things, we may get something promising figure. But if we just want to understand quality of life in terms of having drinking water in the premise, having latrine in the premise, and having electricity, of course, with electricity availability, the achievement is really poor. And this is what I mean by from quantity to quality. If we look at the urban continuum, we have to focus now. Most of our agricultural strategy from the days of Green Revolution were based on improving the productivity, farm productivity and farm production, and some kind of production diversification, let's say from food grains to non-food grains. But the emphasis has always been more on production. And in comparison, the emphasis on post-production value chain, what typically is called from the field to the plate, that we have nationally have not invested enough. Now to imagine this urban continuum, this is where the new investment and new emphasis has to happen. Now that entails a lot of different things. One is, of course, the storage. The second is economic transport. The third is processing, further processing. The fourth is quality, achieving quality. The fifth is balancing the prices of the market and all that. And now we are, of course, in a different kind of crisis, which is purely a price crisis issue that is we are facing. The second point on this urban continuum is that for so many years, we have not adequately invested in what in other countries they call vocational education. We have invested in essentially liberal arts, liberal education, and we have not invested enough. Now, if you look at many other countries, this is where our priorities have not been adequate. Even if you look at China, they have a very strong and very robust national vocational education and skilling kind of infrastructure, which we simply don't have. I mean, we have tried some kind of skill development, which is not exactly a vocational education. We have also have a vocational education national curriculum. But however, the overall emphasis, impetus, and investment in this vocational education has been not adequate at all. The third part is the focus on mobility, which is quality education, telecom penetration, and higher technical education in small towns. The important thing to note here is that the growth in metropolitan cities of the country have actually stagnated. That is should be getting shown from data year after year. From 2001 onwards, it's almost getting stagnated, whereas the real growth is happening in the small and medium-sized towns. And that is where in next 25 years, the real growth will and shall happen. If that has to take place, and that is one way to go forward, it's very important that we have very strong, good quality education and technical education based in small and medium-sized towns and not only in metropolitan cities. And of course, development of small towns is another important area, because development of small towns will mean the growth in the peri-urban area of the small towns as well. I will move forward to show something also interesting, which is, if you look at the inclusion aspect, there has been decrease in rural inequality, definitely in 9 states, and there's been marginal increase in 5 states and marginal decreases in 7 states. So there is a huge variety, huge comparative difference in the decrease of rural inequality in monthly personal consumption expenditure based inequality. And that needs to be addressed very, very strongly. If you look at the human development variation across the states, we have on the one side, very high level of human development, let's say Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Himachal Pradesh. And on the other hand, we have 7 states, we are very far from that. And there is a very clear link of this kind of variation with the concentration of SC/ST population. Of course, that's only one factor. There are other factors as well. If we look at the access to business of the SC/STs, for example, you will look at at the present, there are about 37 million own account enterprises, and there's only 9.8 to 4.5% are operated by this. So there are a lot to be done at a macro level, even when we are talking about social economic inclusion. Interestingly, I can tell you that there is a very good atlas now of business in terms of how, in what states, in what districts SC/STs are in business. I can send you the reference later through the mail, through ISDM. And it's very interesting to see the differences and variations across the states. If we go forward to the idea, the question of sustainability, we really have a very, 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 very large problem looming over us. One is, of course, the per capita land availability, which also means that if we have this much of fragmented land holding, and at the same time, the population is still very much focused and concentrated in agriculture, and on the other hand, the agriculture and allied sector is not producing adequate to the GDP, which means there is this tremendous need to reduce the population the population pressure on land. And that is one important arena of sustainability. Otherwise, the farming, agriculture, or other allied sectors will not be sustainable. There's an even more problem that we see if we look at the quality of land. This is this ISRO data, which is slightly dated, it is about, I think, 2011 or 12 data, that 57% land is already degraded in the land soil health sense. We have now a soil health program, which is a good thing, but it requires a much bigger attention. We had commons as a part of providing a huge lot of ecological services, as well as pastures and other things. If we say that we are a milk producing country, and then we have one of the largest populations of the cows, milching cows in the world, but the pastures are not there, and the pastures were mostly commons, and that is almost gone. This particular factor is very well known, that we have the most polluted cities of the world. I would like you to see a map, which I couldn't load it here. I'm not very savvy in these things, but just Google World Resources Institute or Google Water Stress Map of India. You will see how deeply stressed we are on the issue of water, and every prediction says that in the next 20 years, India is just on the verge of a severe water crisis. And the other important but probably crucial thing that is happening, and we are not ready to address that fully, which is that the agricultural cropping systems across the country and the climate system, there was a synchronicity that evolved through years and decades and centuries, which means that a certain climate would provide provisions for certain types of agriculture. Since the climate system is now getting erratic, the agricultural and climate system link is getting out of sync every year, which means the time when you need the rainfall, the rainfall is not happening. The time when you don't need the rainfall, that is happening. The time when your crop is ripe, you have a hailstorm that is increasing. So this synchronicity that has been achieved through an organic process for over many years and decades is really getting worrisome and out of sync in this. So on the other side of it, we just talk about with sustainability principles. I mean, I can ignore this part perhaps a little bit. We are quite familiar, I'm sure the audience is today, about these issues. So I'll go forward to essentially talk about some issues about quantity to quality. And these are issues which perhaps need to be addressed in a robust way. For example, we have been doing these rural housing programs. In various times, it was named variously, from Indira Awas program to Pradhan Mantri Awas programs and all that. And we have built millions of houses, actually. The question that is then, okay, from simple number coverage, do we have houses built that are occupied and that are used? So that's the kind of transformation that is needed. On the focus of MNREGA, we have been focusing mostly on the issue of are we able to provide 100 days of work, because that's been the priority. At the same time, there was the second objective of NREGA Act as well as the program has been to build productive assets. We have not paid adequate attention to that aspect of it. For again, the issue of number of houses using electricity to the number of hours, the number of students in school to number of students in learning, the number of youth trained in skills to youth trained in skilled jobs or getting into jobs, and essentially a transformation from very unskilled or a very low level of skill level to a much more highly skilled workforce, where no matter whether it is in agriculture or in livestock or in fisheries or in even on other non-farm sectors of the employment. This is more or less the story that I want to, but if I want to close it by certain overarching comments, one is that our emphasis on rural development has always been coverage for many, many years in terms of housing, in terms of roads, in terms of number of schools, in terms of number of kids in the school, in terms of number of Anganwadis, etc. There's an enormous need now to look at from coverage to quality. That's one important point I'm coming back. The second point I'm coming back is that even though we have done significantly promising work in aggregate coverage, there are large pockets and small pockets in almost all states where there's a lot to be done so far inclusion is concerned, inclusion in employment, inclusion in livelihoods, inclusion in basic needs from drinking water to electricity and all that. The third is, it's very, very critical now that we start thinking of rural transformation in continuum with urban development. And we cannot think anymore these two in isolation, which means that in some ways, in terms of governance, in terms of public administration, in terms of development programs and schemes and yojanas, we have to combine the imagination, and we can't work in isolation. And there are some examples like that are there at a very local level, in which, let us say, a municipality and the associated gram panchayats or associated blocks are trying to develop a composite plan of the area. So these are some small examples that exists, but our development planning thinking has never been focusing on these two things together. The fourth is, again, another very important thing, which is combining development with sustainability. And sustainability has two aspects of it. One is purely ecological sustainability, and this other is socio-ecological sustainability or social sustainability. And our development processes, which have been essentially driven by modernization of the rural part of the country, have created, in fact, not only that it has not addressed it, it has also created severe stress in terms of ecological and social stress that needs to be addressed in a very urgent way. And the last would be that, okay, we have to think definitely, absolutely differently in terms of providing employment and how we can have a future in which the rural and the urban doesn't have an extractive relationship, which means essentially the urban draws from the rural and the rural draws from the urban. But there's a mutual recognition necessary that we have to have a different kind of imagination for the future. I would stop here and maybe we can talk about and take some few questions if you like, because then I can explain a little bit more. Or yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Sarkar, and that was very, very helpful for all of us. We have some of our friends who've shared their questions, so I'll read out them to you aloud for all of us to know, and you can share your thoughts on those. So I'll start off with a question, which is, in the growing impact of urbanization and modernization, what is the role in culture of any village?
Okay. If I understood it correctly, I think what we are talking about is that, has culture anything to do with the way we imagine our future, the way we imagine modernization, etc.? Now, there's not an easy answer to this, but let me take some few points. Let me just put forward a few points in this. In all cultures, whether it is, we call it traditional, or we call it indigenous, or we call it ethnic, or we call it modern, there are elements which in some way needs to be preserved. And some elements are there in all cultures which needs to change over a period of time. For example, in all subsistence economies and all economies which were based on hunting, gathering, or foraging, for example, mountainous livelihoods, or forest-based livelihoods, or nomadic livelihoods, or even fisher folks' livelihoods, there are elements of their own culture, not only of production, but also of ways of life, which have very concretely recognized the importance and criticality of conservation and preservation of the ecological resources. Now, when we talk of aggressive modernization, we have lost that in critical knowledge. Not only the critical knowledge, we also lost a lot of those critical practices that again, we have to take a look at that and see if we have to change those things. On the other side of it, if we have to defend modernity, I think what is important in modernity is to recognize the basic equality of human beings, no matter or irrespective of the class, creed, or religion, or ethnicity, or color, or race. And the other thing that is important to understand is that there is human imagination, which existed earlier also, but which also flourished in the modern times. So what I'm trying to argue is that culture has a very important role to imagine the kind of society we need. And our imagination is currently dominantly driven only by one type of imagination of the future society, whereas we need to bring in cultural, not only heritage, but also the cultural future. So I'm not sure if I got the question right and I've been able to answer it, but that would be my thoughts.
Great. There's another question, which is, in your opinion, is micro planning for village planning a weak link? Professor Sarkar, am I audible to you?
Oh. Any question? Yeah, you are audible. Am I audible to you?
Yes. So the question is, in your opinion, is micro planning for village planning a weak link?
Okay. Well, it's thought them their own economic resources and all that. Now, there is an important element in which if people start thinking about how to govern the resources they already have, and resources are of three kinds. One is the resource of the state, which is coming from the state, the resources of the community itself, and the resources coming out of nature, whether it is on the surface or below the surface. So in that sense, my planning is a good thing. But if you have to look at that we of the village itself, I think there has to be a different imagination of micro planning, which is much more integrative across horizontally as well as vertically, which means also means linked with other villages. And there is this idea that now is now gaining ground in various circles, which is what we called a region of self-sufficiency. For example, is it possible to think that within a radius or diameter, if you know, from any point, is it possible to needs of all human beings? For example, is it to satisfy the need of the food, need of the housing, need of some finance, need of some transport, and need of some banking? Now, there have been studies done in India which shows that out of the 5 these kind of needs, it's possible to actually achieve 2 slightly higher level of planning, the 4 part of it, because clothing requires a very different kind of, but if you talk of food, if you talk of banking, if you talk of education, if you talk of healthcare, and if you talk of transport, these 4 are possible. The clothing is not. So there are studies now available which tells us that the idea of micro planning in a very small village is no longer the futuristic idea, but planning in the sense that people start thinking and actually acting collectively, socially, about governing their own resources is certainly very important for thinking about future.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. So you mentioned that we've done a good job in terms of coverage. The question is, how do we get policy makers to think more on the lines of sustainability?
Okay. So it's important that we develop, I think this has to be done in multiple levels. One is important to think, let us say, let me say, because to restore consider reminds time in history, which is now reduced to just about 50 lakes, and most of the lakes have either been covered and got housing done or other things done. But Bangalore's entire water resource was based on these large numbers of lakes. And most of the lakes have now degraded or closed or this and that, negotiated with Palike or something, to say that, look, is it possible to really restore these lakes and have it serve ecological services, social services, and also economic services. So there are examples of that kind. This is one what we may call constructive work at local level and engaging that. The second, what is again happening in Bangalore, is a lot of resistance against this steel flyovers or this entire, Periyar, what we call is a outer ring, complete outer ring infrastructure through railways and this the roads. So what I'm saying is that there is citizen action necessary at the level of the local, and when I say local, I mean in the metropolitan local as well as in small towns. That is at one level. The second level is that at the state policy, which is still very much dominated by growth, but there are also examples of that change happening. For example, Andhra Pradesh is one state which have decided, and they're going forward vigorously to completely transform their agriculture from what I call toxic agriculture to what they would call natural farming agriculture. And their targets is about 10 years to completely change the agricultural input cycle and agricultural crop cycle and a host of other measures. So they're massively committed so far, I could see that. And this is at the state level, which is not a small entity. And there was a time when there were citizens groups advocated for CNG and LPG in the autos. There was a time when people forced of this standards, BS4 standard or BS3 standards in the vehicles. So citizen action in policy discussions are the way forward, and it has to happen at local as well as state as well as national levels. Interestingly, the other point that we have to come to terms with is that India is a country of elections, and elections determine the nature of politics in India. So somehow sustainability issues have to be brought by citizen groups, rural, urban, into the body politic of the country. What I mean by body politic is the way politics is done on an everyday basis. I think that is something we are still not doing very well. And my sense is we should be doing much more of that. So I can keep on talking, but let me just stop here. Yeah.
How as urban youth can we contribute to the rural urban and make it qualitative and not just quantitative?
The role of the urban youth?
Yes.
One of the things that people are doing with urban youth is in various cities, this kind of things are happening in Mumbai, in Bangalore, in Delhi as well. I guess in slightly smaller but big cities as well, which is that how do we bring urban youth into the idea of active citizenship? When I mean active citizenship is that, okay, urban youth has their own personal career ambitions, their own personal intellectual ambitions, their own personal maybe social ambitions. At the same time, in what way we can bring urban youth uh, into their citizenship role is something that people are talking about. Now, this is, I would call, is the starting point, because if you are starting from a citizenship part of a intervention, then you have to think of, okay, when we may be residing in urban settings, and we may be living with the resources that the urban settings provide us, but in what way we are dependent on the people that are there in rural India. I mean, in many ways, we are actually dependent, particularly not only food. People always think of only food, but there are other ways also we are dependent from rural India. Not, for example, even cotton. We are dependent on that, and in many other ways, we are dependent on all the furnitures that come mostly from forests and rural. We please understand that 170,000 villages in the country have village forests, and that forest resources are converted into either timber or other medicinal plants or other new items which come ultimately to. And nowadays, if you look at the ways rural is contributing to the urban, is this entire body care industry where everything is, Ayurvedic or non-chemical and etc., which all are coming from vast rural and forested areas. So in many, many ways, urban youth, not only youth, even non-youth are dependent. So the awareness and consciousness of our mutual dependency. On the other side, our penetration of urban markets in rural areas have brought good things as well as have brought not so good things. I mean, there are certainly things that have been now much more available. For example, medicines are much more available now in rural areas. Emergency transports are much more available in rural areas. So there is this recognition that has to happen, what we call mutual dependency. And there are a lot of work happening on citizenship with urban youth. But the thing that I keep on telling these people whenever I happen to meet is that how do we create the consciousness about our mutual dependency? And we try to understand that, okay, it's not that we are doing a benevolence when we are providing rural development funding and we're also providing tax, or our parents are providing tax. Actually, they are also providing a lot of things to maintain the life that we are. We can keep on talking of more. For example, we can keep on talking about the prices of agricultural items. The prices of agricultural items can be, okay, there is a definite case to make that the prices of agricultural items are very consciously made low so that these are all available very cheaply in the urban areas. And there are cases to be made on the rivers as well. So there are lots that can be done with the rural youth to understand and work. And then there are many small works that can be done as well. I'll stop here. Yeah.
Professor Sarkar, people want to know, do you have any examples of socio-economic development done in sync with ecological sustainability anywhere in India, especially in rural?
If you look at the growth of, let's say, okay, let me put it this way. There are many small examples, hundreds and hundreds of small examples in India where in the rural, and when I mean rural, I come to in terms of governance, I come to the gram panchayats or block panchayats or even a district, where people have talked about, or even small municipalities. There are very good examples of very green small municipalities where waste management has been tackled and addressed in a very good way and very sustainable way for long years. And in fact, Mysore is one of the greatest examples. And there are about 25 small municipalities which are very green in that sense. They have been able to manage tree cover. They've been able to manage waste. They've been able to manage water supply in a reasonable way. At the same time, they've been able to do basic economic development and human development as well. So we have lots of small examples, and not so small, but not so large as well. It's just that we don't have very large scale example, let us say, of a big city doing something, or a big rural area doing something. Let's say we have, on the other side of it, let us say, if you look at agriculture, I mean, there are again many small examples, not so small as well, where agricultural practices have changed on the ground due to interventions by civil society, due to interventions by local progressive farmers, where production as well as ecology are maintained in a number of ways. So if you look at the works that you will see in parts of Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, parts of Bengal, there are many ways that people are doing it. There have been very interesting works on ecologically sustainable livestock breeding. So there are large works done there. But these are examples which, in a scale of India, on the scale of its population, its geography, its diversity, its huge differences, this, I would tend to call them still small. So, but there are things to learn from them. I mean, there are, for example, if you take, ecologically sustainable healthcare services, and there are examples of that kind, but at a smaller level again. So there are very different examples that exist, but it's difficult to say that, okay, a large area of a setup. When Indian states are, the states of India are, look at Maharashtra. Maharashtra is bigger than the largest country of Western Europe, which is Germany. So we are talking still of scale which is different, right? But yeah, there are definitely existing examples.
Great. Just in the interest of time, one final question for you. So, what can be done to improve learning outcomes in the rural areas? Learning outcomes of students.
Yeah, this is a question that is bothering everyone. I think learning outcomes are directly related to the teacher capability and the educational environment of the area, of the school, and not only about, of course, there are contributions to be made by the books, but I think it's a lot to do with teacher capability, and also teacher getting motivated in time. The primary school teachers or the secondary school teachers are, and there have been studies to show that, almost 40% of their time go into non-teaching works of the government of various kinds. So that is one important thing to be done. I think it's very important to recognize that teaching is a very complex role. It is preparation and training. We have not invested in teaching as a profession as in the country itself. So it's not that learning outcomes can't be improved, and there are every country that we can speak of, from Japan to China to Korea to even Taiwan to even Thailand, or even, I'm not talking Western Europe, even let us say Brazil. There have been great examples of how teaching and learning outcomes can be increased at a very significant level. But the important investment is in the entire teaching infrastructure. If you look at, let's say, look at teacher educators, I think we are the worst country in the world which have done almost nothing to educate and prepare the teachers. We have completely messed up, for example, early childhood learning. I mean, we all know that the brain development and the early childhood learning is the critical aspect of any child development. But our model of early childhood learning is still with the Anganwadis. And we all know how Anganwadis work and what is the overall investment in of the society to strengthen Anganwadi system or a child learning system. We have not even invested. I mean, the Anganwadi's workers' salary just is about 8,000 rupees or something like that today. We have nearly, some 500,000 Anganwadis in the country, perhaps. I'm not sure the figure of. So, in general, as a large public investment in teacher educational infrastructure, we have not done that. We have done the primary part of it, which is basically opening up schools and providing blackboards and benches. But we have not done anything beyond. So now that investment is required for any country you take. They have done that investment for at least 25 years, which gives them the result. Yes.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Professor Sarkar. So we are at 7:02 and I'd like to wind up the webinar, and I can see a huge engagement from participants. Apologies for not being able to take all your questions, but we'll make an effort to answer these questions for all of you in a follow-up email. Once again, thank you very, very much, Professor Sarkar, for joining us, and all the participants for
Thanks to all the participants as well for being patient. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Can I log off now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll log off.